Can you talk through how the MLETR, or the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Record, and how it's been implemented into UK law via the Electronic Trade Documents Act, has that influenced other countries around the world to consider adopting similar trade legislation around digital documents, the acceptance?
So the ETDA was bound to have a very positive impact on the international trade landscape and regulations.
We expected transaction time to be quicker, and with the removal of the need to courier bill of exchange or prom note back and forth to the bank to ourselves.
The Electronic Trade Documents Act just deals with a really tiny legal problem that existed before. I mean, it's tiny in terms of the simple question that arose in relation to attempts to use electronic trade documents.
I'm Dipesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global.
And I'm Susan Ashworth from Matalan.
I'm Sarah Green from D2 Legal Technology.
And I'm Surath Sengupta from Lloyds Banking Group.
Welcome to Trade Finance Talks, your go-to trade, treasury and payments podcast, brought to you by TFG. I'm Dipesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global. Today, we're diving into one of the most significant developments, I think, in recent trade history, which is the enactment of the Electronic Trade Documents Act, or the ETDA, which happened on the 20th of September 2023. Now, when it was launched in the UK, the hope was that the paradigm on trade documents would completely shift. Perhaps there would have even been a scramble internationally to adopt similar measures. But looking at these developments 1 year on, today we're exploring if and how this new system has impacted businesses, if it's enhanced efficiency, or perhaps even minimized the carbon footprint of international trade. Can we really see those benefits trickling down to smaller businesses? And what's next for the ETDA? My guests today answer these fundamental questions and delve into many more specifics, including different sectors and how they're adapting to this digital shift. We're going to be focusing on the novel partnership between Lloyds, Matalan, and Inigio, because what better encapsulates this than cross-border collaboration? I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Green at D2 Legal Technology, Susan Ashworth at Matalan, Surath Sengupta at Lloyds Banking Group. Hello and welcome to Trade Finance Talks. So, quick introductions. Who are you, where are you from, and what do you do? Sarah, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Green from D2 Legal Technology. I'm here today to talk about the ETDA because in my previous role, I was Law Commissioner and oversaw the enactment of that piece of legislation. And I now help organisations implement technology to comply with those legal requirements.
Thank you very much. And many of our listeners will know you through your former capacity at the Law Commission and the impact you had on ensuring MLETR, or the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, I got that right this time, was successfully enacted into UK law. Sue, over to you.
Hi, I'm the Senior Trade Finance Specialist within Matalan's omnichannel retailer. I deal with all the shipping documents and all the trade finance documents on a daily basis. I'm the one that's pushing for the electronic documents within Matalan with our suppliers on a whole.
Thank you very much and welcome. It's really good to have you here, Sue. Surath, over to you.
Thank you, Dipesh. So I'm Surath Sengupta, Managing Director, Innovation and Transformation for Trade and Working Capital within Lloyds Banking Group. So my team and I are sort of focused on digitizing the documentary trade part of the business completely. That's the reason why I'm here. We have led and pioneered on a lot of transactions with Matalan, with other customers, to make sure that we are well on the way on this journey after the ETDA has been passed.
Thank you very much, Surath. Let's just go back to the basics, and apologies, Sarah, I've probably asked you this question many times, but for the benefit of our listeners, can you give a quick overview of what the ETDA will forgive those listeners who haven't heard of it yet? But also, can you talk through some of the challenges and that journey that were faced in the development and the passage of this act into Parliament?
The Electronic Trade Documents Act just deals with a really tiny legal problem that existed before. I mean, it's tiny in terms of the simple question that arose in relation to attempts to use electronic trade documents. But of course, impact and its influence, it certainly isn't tiny. And it was basically just to address the fact that the law, as was before 2023, couldn't deal with documents in electronic form, or at least they couldn't have the same legal effect as their paper counterparts, because the law did not recognise documents that it regarded as intangible as capable of being possessed and held and transferred. And there is statute and other law that required these documents, such as bills of lading, to be possessed and held and transferred if they were going to do what they needed to do, which was to give the parties who held those documents the rights to the things to which those documents related. So it's a real tiny sort of lawyer's law problem, but created real issues in the real world when commercial parties understandably didn't want to use paper documents anymore, that they had to transport across the globe in huge quantities, of course very bad environmentally as well. It took a long time, can take weeks to perform a transaction. So essentially what that 2023 Act does is says in 6 substantive sections that where digital documents or electronic documents, however you want to put it, have certain characteristics and perform certain functions which emulate paper, they should be treated by the law as exactly equivalent to paper. So it's now possible, of course, for instance, distributed ledger technology for those documents to do that. Historically, it wasn't, so there was a double spend problem. You didn't want any digital document being used in this way because you can just pass it on and duplicate it. But that's what this Act now does. So it's possible to use electronic documents. The challenges were mostly, different to other Law Commission projects in that there weren't many objectors to the project as a whole, and it was pretty easy to see why we needed to do this. But there was a sort of natural resistance, I think, to new risks. And of course, the electronic documents bring with them new risks. Now, I think that on aggregate, though, that group of risks is a lot smaller than paper documents. So the number of times that I heard, we don't want to use electronic documents because what if the server goes down and we lose the documents? Obviously, servers can come back up and documents are still there. And paper is, of course, incredibly fallible in a way that electronic documents are. It can be lost, it can be stolen, it can be forged. We all know what you can do with paper. So I think most of those objections, once we explain that actually there are risks with digital documents, but they're a lot lower than they are with paper documents. And if we were going to design this system from scratch today, in 2023 as was, nobody would suggest doing it with paper. So once you make that point, I think that was the easiest way to get over those objections. And that was the biggest challenge. Apart from the usual vagaries of the parliamentary process, but that was nothing to do with trade and everything to do with the political environment at the time.
Thank you very much. Now, Surath, you're in the business of, assessing risk. So this is really important for you and Lloyds Banking Group. But can you talk through how the MLETR, or the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Record, and how it's been implemented into UK law via the Electronic Trade Documents Act, has that influenced other countries around the world to consider adopting similar trade legislation around digital documents, the acceptance of them, etc.?
Firstly, I think what we need to understand is that about 60 to 70% of world trade is documented under English law. So the ETDA was bound to have a very positive impact on the international trade landscape and regulations. It's also great that UK was the first G7 country to pass this legislation, because it puts us in a very, very good position to lead the whole journey around how do we implement this, which are the countries that we need to speak with, how do we get it done. And that is exactly what has been following from there. So we already have a few countries which have adopted it. We know France has adopted it. Some of the bigger ones are France, who adopted it. We've got Singapore, we've got US at a federal level now going through the states. But these are some of the big ones. And then there are a few other ones who have already adopted it. And we also know that some of the other large countries, including some other G7 countries, this is in progress. So I think the journey has started and it's moving in the right direction. But what's also interesting, Dipesh, is that even in countries where MLETR has not been adopted as yet, in India, for example, we are seeing banks and corporates accept contractual EBLs or electronic bills of lading, as well as relying on common law digital promissory notes issued by UK companies. There is what has started here. It's taking time, etc., to really bed itself down. But it's a great journey that has already started and it's having a great impact globally around different countries starting to adopt this. We recently did a transaction where we had a UK corporate and an American supplier, and on both sides it was done completely digitally end to end. So I think that's the power of this legislation, and I think it's set to change global trade significantly.
It's an interesting nuance around global trade finance, because actually a lot of trade finance is denominated around the US dollar as a currency, but actually in terms of the law, that many of the transactions, they come under the law in England and Wales. Sue, I would probably brand you as an early mover in terms of using and benefiting from the ETDA. Perhaps you can talk through what some of the unexpected outcomes, if any, were from the first transaction that Matalan did under the ETDA. I think on the day it came into force. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So when Lloyds and myself were talking through our expectations before the law change, we expected transaction time to be quicker, and with the removal of the need to courier bill of exchange or prom note back and forth to the bank to ourselves. So upon the first transaction, we actually saved around 2 days and saved courier charges twice for the first time transaction. The fact that we didn't have to join a network for Trace Original, do the digital prom note, it was sent via email link, and that was very easy to use, very user friendly, and it was only required a light touch. So that was one of the unexpected outcomes, as we was expecting to have to sign up to multiple different solutions. Other unexpected outcomes were how few corporate companies took up the digital trade option from the off. Upon Matalan completing the transaction from day one, it's also given me the opportunity in meeting key players in our attempt in scaling up, such as gaining support from the DCSA, ICC UK. So it's good to gain knowledge and share our practical experiences. So that's been an unexpected outcome.
Thank you, Sue. And I guess following on from that, Sarah, what are your thoughts on the speed at which corporates are adopting some of these trade solutions under the ETDA? Is there reticence? Would you say that adoption is happening? Are these corporates willing to innovate? And would you say that there's a difference between the way corporates are seeing the adoption of ETDA versus SMEs?
Yes, there's definitely reticence. And again, I think that goes back to the idea about unfamiliar risks in part. I mean, of course, it's also that this requires investment on a number of levels. So people are not, and organisations are maybe thinking there might not be a first mover advantage, depending on where you are, I think, in the chain and in the network. So there has been, and there continues to be, some reticence. There's actually less than I thought. It's been a bit of a mixture. So I was prepared for the legal change to happen and then there to be a bit of a hiatus before it was really taken up, because it is such a change. And one of the sort of hallmarks, I guess, of English commercial law certainly is that it doesn't change very often and doesn't change very much, which is why it's used so often, because parties like to know what they're going to get and they like to know what their expectations, whether their expectations are going to be met. So I fully expected there to be a delay. It was actually not as great as I thought. And obviously, as we've heard, on the day, there was already activity. So that was a lot more front-loaded than I expected. And there were lots more enthusiasm and a preparedness to dive in than I was thinking. I thought there might be just a bit more testing the water at a slower pace. So it's been a mixture, really. So there were more early adopters than I was expecting. But I think there now is still a need to, I think, spread the word really and reassure organisations that, well, basically, I think this is inevitable. So this is where we need to be. And there's a bit of an education element to that as well, which is the main point, I think. It doesn't all have to be done overnight. A lot of the organisations I've spoken to, particularly SMEs, so to go actually to your question, I think the concern for SMEs is that they feel that if they were going to digitalise, it needs to be all or nothing in a matter of weeks or months, that they have to just change all their processes, which is of course not true at all. The short answer is it's a mixture. I think larger corporations have the capacity to be able to take the risk. Then, of course, they're not as internally sort of agile as larger corporations. So there are some SMEs that have surprised me and some larger corporations that have surprised me.
To go back on Sue's point about the courier charges and the time taken, I have just couriered some deeds with wet signatures and it's been an absolute nightmare. I can imagine this scales up if you're a large corporate with tens of thousands of documents. Sue, what's the bigger picture? What impact would you say the transition to digital trade documents have had versus what you used to do? And would you say there are new opportunities that are opening up as a result of this?
There is. It's been enabled to streamline a couple of processes using the digital collections. So we've been able to remove parties within the documentary collections that we've done digitally. It's made it simpler and far much quicker. With regards to financing, we don't offer this option on documentary collections. But if the supplier was to receive finance upon acceptance, they'll be able to provide quick access by funds buyers accepting the bill of exchange digitally. And also, like a lot of businesses, our processes are being built around paper. So we're working towards a more digital process internally with stakeholders to reduce the reliance on paper.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, back to the original question, would you say there are particular sectors, so perhaps like the retail sector, for example, that have shown more or faster progress than others in adopting some of these trade processes under the ETDA over the past 12 months?
Yeah, certainly. So retail, you've already mentioned. I mean, shipping of goods, particularly perishable goods, because it's obvious why. Time is of the essence in those transactions. And of course, that time saving makes a particular difference. That might seem like a really obvious thing to say, but actually shipping is not the only... I talked to a lot of people who seem to think that this change is only going to affect shipping and that sort of level of trade and that sort of context of trade. And it isn't, but I think it's certainly, you've already mentioned the DCSA, and the biggest initiatives, and I think the most promising initiatives are in shipping, goods and retail.
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it. And I know some of these large shipping associations have made pretty solid commitments to fully digitise their bills of lading and made time commitments.
Yeah, they're quite ambitious, some of them. But the longer you set the deadline, the more likely you are to leave it until then to do it.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that I think has been particularly encouraging.
We like ambitious targets because then we can hold them accountable a few years later. Surath, I'd like you to talk through the Lloyds, Matalan and Inigio relationship, and perhaps we can start from the top, and if you can talk about how that relationship works, and perhaps you can talk through the story of that first digital transaction under the ETDA over a year ago, if you could perhaps describe that moment.
Sure. Actually, just before we go into that day, we were already doing of digital transactions before this became an act. So some of this we were doing under ITFA's DNI using the electronic payment undertaking. So we had done that. We had done some work with the house building sector to do. And because of that, we had seen that there was a great adoption and a great benefit in using this. So we were like super ready for the act to come in, and we have a great relationship with Matalan, and we sort of worked with them to say that, okay, look, there are this act coming. This is the transaction that we can digitize. We want to work with you on this. So actually, on the day the act came into place, this is quite interesting. Just after midnight on that day, we were actually able to pass the link to Matalan. So we were that ready to do this transaction, that keen to do this transaction, because we wanted this act to come through. We wanted to be the first bank there. Not because of being the first, but we know how important this is from digitizing documentary trade. So that link was sent to Susan and Matalan for acceptance. That's how from our side it went there. And I think you signed it first thing in the morning, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think I got up early, so I was up in work for 6 o'clock because we had the idea that we could be the first, but we didn't think we'd be the first. So it was an early start to get that pushed over the line. So it was all completed by 7 a.m.
That was the first transaction. 7 a.m. next day, the first transaction had already gone through.
Surath, why did Lloyds decide to develop that comprehensive digital collection offering? And perhaps you can go into a bit more detail about some of the other partnerships. And can I ask you to go into a bit more detail about the Inigio partnership, exactly what the offering is? I know Trace Original is the product, and also on the document side, on the Wave BL side, how that partnership works. What I'm trying to do is put all the different pieces of the puzzle together to tell the story of how then that partnership between Matalan and Lloyds can grow.
Sure, Dipesh. We were and remain keen to solve the pain points associated with the presentation of documents under documentary trade products. The process for issuing documentary credits or LCs has been electronic for a long time, right? Nearly all LCs are currently issued by SWIFT, at least international LCs. It's the presentation of the documents under the LC which is heavily paper-based. And this can be whether it's even if it's not an LC, if it's a collection as well, it's all paper, right? So that means that there's heavy amount of paper involved, paper which flows from one corner of the world to another. So we focused initially on the collections piece to see how do we simplify and digitize that. It's a simpler documentary trade product than doing a full LC. So we focused on that first. And we believe that the savings in terms of time were more realizable for this product because there's no examination under URC or UCP. Bringing together the EBL issuance and handling, we used WaveBL, for example, for this. DPN or Digital Promissory Note generation on NEGO's Trace Original, and ICC's E-rules for collection, which is EURC. So we brought all of that together. So EBLs, Digital Promissory Notes, and using EURC, we were able to develop a fully digital solution that drastically reduced the transaction times and removed all paper from the process. And when I'm saying drastically removed, this is going from weeks and months to hours and minutes. That's the kind of difference that this made. And just imagine, like you were talking about tens and thousands of such transactions for certain corporates. So if all of those transactions went down from weeks and months to hours and minutes, that's the kind of working capital benefit that these corporates or SMEs can actually get out of this. For digital collections done so far, we've been utilizing WaveBL for handling the EBLs. We partnered with them because of the traction that they have in the EBL market, with about 500,000 EBLs that they've issued so far. And 4 of the top 10 container carriers by volume utilize their system. So that's a good one. And on NEGO, I think we've done a number of pioneering digital use cases involving digital promissory notes or digital bills of exchanges, digital guarantees, etc. A key advantage of Trace Original is that it is an open system, which means that parties can receive documents or amend them while in possession and transfer to other parties on NEGO's public notary without having to sign commercial terms or be part of the NEGO network. So I think that is a key reason why we use NEGO, because it allows other parties to come into the transaction without having to necessarily sign up on NEGO. And in terms of next steps, Dipesh, I think we really want to take this collections process and now move that into a documentary credit or an LC process as well, because we believe that there's a huge gap there as well, that we can crunch the time again into hours and days instead of the months that it takes today.
Yeah, thank you. I think the UK government estimates that 25 billion paper documents are created globally each year to facilitate some of that container shipping. Sue, can you validate that? Is that correct? What were some of the practical benefits that were realised from Matalan side? Perhaps you can also talk from your side about some recently completed digital collections transactions.
We recently completed a fully digital documentary collection. So the collection was fairly complex when on paper. There was 2 freight forwarders, 3 banks and 3 corporates involved within it. So we were able to remove 2 banks from the process, with it being come digitally, and with Lloyds only needing to be involved. The Indian bank was happy to receive a copy of the invoice and bill of lading, and Lloyds were happy to receive directly from our counterparty. We brought all the parties together to demonstrate the solution and arrange for the remaining parties to join WaveBL. So OCA, our Indian forwarder, issued a EBL to our shipper Magnum Limited, who endorsed the EBL to ETDA, which is our UK counterparty, and who in turn uploaded the documentary collection and scheduled to Lloyds Bank. So once it was all processed their side, I completed a digital prom note via Trace Original, and then Lloyds released the documentary collection onto ourselves. So in turn, I then surrendered the EBL to MW freight forwarders. So the key benefits were reduction of transaction time. So it normally takes 25 to 30 days for it all to complete on paper-based, and we got it down to just under 2 hours. So we removed the need to courier documents, so these could be couriered off for this collection up to 9 times during the paper process, and we removed all the associated fees. There was a reduction of bank fees, with 2 banks taken out of the process completely, and all parties have agreed to digitalise this whole particular flow going forward. So this is going to be a minimum of 100 transactions per year. The counterparties, the forwarders, they've seen clear benefits from going digital, so they're keen to push on with this process. The unforeseen challenges was there was none with this transaction, as we were impressed how smoothly and efficiently it went, but it was up to me. I'll do all collections digital because it's simpler, quicker, and you're not getting lost in the bureaucracy of all the paperwork. but there is still a whole lot of work to be done on getting suppliers onboarded, going digital, making them aware of the new law, making like the country's banks aware of the Melita. So it's just to keep pushing and shouting about, and that there is clear benefits to going digital.
If that's not a good example of business case, I don't really know what is. I mean, everyone's smiling. It's probably taking us about 2 hours to record this podcast as well. So that's the comparison. To your point, Sue, on the wider piece, educating corporates. I mean, I hope there are corporates listening to this podcast, and here's a real tangible example, and you can clearly see business benefits, but actually engaging suppliers into the wider tech ecosystem. Sarah, what role would you say fintechs and tech providers play in addressing the need for simpler, more accessible digital trade platforms?
Huge, in short. I think they're pivotal really in the whole process, because we have this legal change. That's what we've been talking about. But I mean, the front line, if you like, all they really need to be told is, this is now legally viable and it's legally okay. And most people don't really care about that. I mean, you don't want really to think about lawyers. You don't really want to think about things going wrong in advance. But what you do want to know is what you can do. You want to be able to see what's possible. You want to be able to see how user-friendly it's going to be, how it's going to fit with what you currently do, how much it's going to cost, all those sorts of questions. And those are, of course, the things the organisations you've just mentioned, tech providers, platforms and fintechs, they are so well placed or perfectly placed to be able to do that. So they're a far more accessible means, I think. We've talked about awareness a few times, we've talked about education, and I think even though it might not look like a sort of formal educational role, those providers in showing organisations exactly what's possible, I think that's really, really important. And when we were doing the consultation for this, when we were trying to get the law passed, I talked about the challenges briefly earlier. One of the ways in which we got over those challenges was to explain that if we made this law change, a lot of the tech companies, and banks, we've already heard that people were ready to go, and that there were providers that could easily tick the boxes that are required under ETDA and MLETR. So back to my original answer, which is I think they're absolutely pivotal.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Surath, how do we move this forward? I mean, I think you've very succinctly described some of the advantages or advances rather that you've made on the documentary collections presentation side. But, how are we going to move this forward to even wider adoption? For example, letters of credit, maybe even payables finance?
We are pioneering quite a few different types of transactions. So we are taking it step by step, looking at every transaction and seeing how we can digitize, then looking at the overall sort of ecosystem and saying, what do we need to do to really make this come to life? So when we looked at it, one of the things that we, along with ITFA, we said is we need banks on the two nodes to do transactions, or financial institutions on the two sides. So we recently announced a transaction that we did with Mercor on the other side. So it was Lloyds on one side, Mercor on the other side. And in that transaction where we utilized Enigio's trace original solution, where Mercor acted on behalf of the seller, arranging for the digital bill of exchange to be drawn before transferring to Lloyds, who we were acting on behalf of the buyer. We secured the acceptance. And Mercor then advanced funds to the seller ahead of maturity. All this was done completely digitally. So this was one of the key milestones that ITFA had set under their DNI initiative. So we just completed that transaction. Other thing that we are looking at is how do you create interoperability? We need significant interoperability for this to scale. So we announced another transaction, which is a Lloyds and Bank of China transaction. And in this, again, working with Enigio, but working with Enigio and a Chinese EBL platform called TradeGo to develop a bilateral interoperable connection between the two platforms based on the Digital Container Shipping Association, the DCSA interoperable standards. Actually, we announced that yesterday, where we created a synthetic transaction and completed it involving freight forwarders, Fred Mayer, and a Swedish beneficiary, and a major Chinese bank and a Chinese importer. The whole process was completed, and hold your breath out here, in 48 minutes. End to end, right? So which demonstrates the amount of time that can be saved when you remove the need to courier documentation from one part of the world to another. The Chinese bank has already issued the first LC that will use this digital highway. So I think, of course, there's a huge benefit from a sustainability perspective, but from a time perspective also, it just reduces and crunches time. The third piece that we are looking at is, again, around interoperability and driving interoperability. We created a proof of value with WaveBL and Swift. So demonstrating the ability to connect WaveBL to Swift so that the non-users of WaveBL platform can receive WaveBL envelopes and electronic bills of lading through the Swift network. Where we've seen that the uptake of banks on some platforms has been a barrier because banks can't go and sign up to all sorts of platforms because it's just not possible from a governance perspective, from resource perspective, etc. Creating this WaveBL Swift interoperability, for example, will allow banks to access digital documents without accessing the WaveBL platform in this case, but other platforms as well going forward.
Thank you very much, Surath. I mean, it's interesting. There are so many different avenues to explore, whether it's how do you address the issuance or the presentation of documentary collections and letters of credit. How do you apply this to a 3-corner model, a 4-corner model? What about multi-bank, multi-platform? How do you incorporate Swift messaging into this? So there's a lot to conquer step by step. A final question to everyone on this podcast. How do you foresee the evolution of digital trade and digital trade documents over the next 5 years? Sarah, I'm going to come to you first.
I think it's going to get quicker. So as I've already said, it started a lot sooner than I thought it would. And I think, obviously, the more transactions that happen and the more organisations that get involved, it just becomes more accessible, less unfamiliar. So I think it's a sort of snowball effect, really. I think that it will speed up over the next 5 years so that each year I think it will be just a far more significant advancement than we've seen in the first 12 months.
Thank you, Sarah. Sue?
Well, being part of the ICC UK Digital Task Force, hopefully over the next 5 years we continue scaling up the benefits as we now have to use case studies, not pilots, which some people are saying, well, they're only pilots. But obviously we've seen the clear benefits with the use case studies. Hopefully it'll be speedier trade, more uptake on the Melita ruling, because a lot of the countries we deal with at the moment, it's a no-go. There's just no entertaining providing digital documents. So we're hoping that it opens up more providers over in international countries. I'm under no illusions, but hopefully doing more and continuing the work we've started, because at the moment we currently do between 13 and 15,000 BLs a year. So even if we get half of them done in 5 years' time, that's perfect for me, and it's a huge cost saving as well.
Thank you, Sue. Surath?
What can I say? This is a game changer, right? We've already demonstrated there is real value, like Susan just mentioned. There is a real value in this. It crunches time in trade finance. It releases working capital. It reduces costs. It creates a more sustainable process. That has been established. If you look at global trade, there is a huge amount of digital adoption already on the open account side, right? Open account trade, which is a significant portion of global trade, is already done mostly digitally, right? Buyers and suppliers are used to using technology. What they were waiting for in this case, like Sarah outlined at the start, is on the digital documentary trade side, can they have equivalence to paper, which is what was missing. It's already there in the UK, as I mentioned, it's already there in France and a few other countries. As the adoption of this becomes more and more in various countries, this will just start scaling up. This will actually see a bit of a slow start as more countries come onto the bandwagon. But once you have a significant number of countries or large countries which have large trade players on the floor, then you'll see just an exponential curve jump. This one.
Thank you very much. I mean, at its core, it seems like quite a simple problem with quite a simple solution. And I think to our listeners at Trade Finance Talks, hey, the tech's here, the legal infrastructure is here, you have the business case, you have the examples. This is how we make trade faster, cheaper, safer, and more efficient. Sue, Sarah, Surath, thank you for joining us on Trade Finance Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you.